Delighted on behalf of LEAD and the Jewish Leadership Council to welcome you from the Jewish community in the UK and beyond. Lovely to see some of you from Europe here as well. Joining us for this event this evening, we are delighted to welcome Jonathan, who's the CEO of Charity Digital. They focus on helping charities increase their impact through their use of digital technology. I was fortunate enough to have a preview of this evening earlier, and I know that Jonathan's very aware that it's a whistle-stop tour of many things, so there's no magic wands here, but hopefully we'll give you some really good prompts. And I know that the frameworks and resources that that Charity Digital are sharing with us afterwards will be really, really valuable for communities across the Jewish organisational spectrum. We've given Jonathan a little bit of a briefing on some of your organisations and a little bit of background on the Jewish community, but they are very used to working with charities at Charity Digital. Our thanks to you, Jonathan, to Mimi and the rest of your team who have helped to make this event happen. We'll thank you all at the end as well. Please feel free, if you're a participant, to put any questions in the chat. We will be sharing on screen. You can size your screen if you want. So if you can't see Jonathan's presentation screen large enough, feel free to resize it. But I will hand over to you. Enough of me talking. Thank you in advance, Jonathan, and go for it.
Good. Thank you, Michelle. Yes, it's wonderful to be here today to talk to you about a subject that I'm really very passionate about. I've been working in the technology area for my entire career, and for most of that time it's been focusing on strategy as well, and as I'm quite old now, that is quite a long time. So hopefully I've learned a few things over those years, and I'm going to aim to share some of that with you today. I just want to check, can everybody see those slides fine? Maybe if Lawrence can give me a wave, that's cool, because I can see Lawrence in my screen. Brilliant, good. So what I'm talking about today, digital strategy, it's obviously a massive area overall. Repeated surveys of charities have shown that around 50% of charities actually typically don't have a digital strategy at any moment in time. And we've only got an hour today for me to do a presentation and to answer your questions as well. So we can really only look to scrape the surface today. But what I'm aiming to do is share a framework that I hope will be really useful and helpful for you. I should make you all aware that we have a digital guide on this, an e-guide, which is on our website. And what we will do when we share the slides of this presentation afterwards, we will also share the link to that. And that's got some more explanation of the subjects that I'm talking about. And it also points out a lot of other resources that I think you might find useful as well. So that's my kind of intro. Let's go on to the next slide now. So, obvious question, why do you need a digital strategy? Well, in one sense, you actually don't, because actually I would say that in the ideal world, you would have a strategy that fully includes digital. So your organization strategy will have digital running through it in a way that is totally integrated. So in that sense, you don't actually need one. Though in practice, if you may be developing one for the first time, it's actually quite useful to focus on it specifically as something that attaches to your main organization strategy, but is also separate as well. And that also gives you a chance to drill into a bit more detail than you would typically have in an overall organization strategy. So in the same way, you might actually have a marketing strategy that sits alongside your organization strategy and populates it with more detail, but is obviously consistent with it. But beyond that, other key reasons for having a digital strategy, well, I think particularly in this post-COVID age, but actually I think many organizations were seeing this over the last 10 years anyway, is this kind of steady increasing in demand for what we all do as our charities. Really hard to meet that, especially in an environment where maybe there are income challenges. We saw that through the kind of the austerity years. We're in recession now, so I think there's going to be more income challenges as well. And we've all seen many events being cancelled, which has contributed to that. Obviously, the digital world provides some wonderful opportunities for charities to communicate more through digital means, through social media, etc. So that's great. It's a really cheap way of communicating. But those digital spaces are also a lot more crowded as well, so it's harder to be noticed. And then in terms of how you respond to the needs of your beneficiaries, often there are competing needs, and you end up generating multiple options. So some of those options will focus maybe in the fundraising area, some in marketing, some will be about how you're providing your services, some might be about how you run your back office. You might want to be more efficient. So how do you actually set about reconciling those competing needs? How do you actually prioritize between them? How do you actually phase them at the end of the day? That's a real challenge. And of course, a digital strategy enables you to work through that process of prioritizing and phasing the developments for your organization. So those are all reasons why you could look at having a digital strategy. Let's talk a little bit about what I mean by digital strategy. Now, I don't want to teach anyone to suck eggs here at all, but I've done a very simple approach of let's just decompose that into the words strategy and digital. So this is actually the Wikipedia definition of strategy. So a general plan to achieve one or more long-term or overall goals under conditions of uncertainty. And within that, the process will set about developing goals, priorities, determining actions to achieve those goals, and then actually how we mobilize resources to execute those actions as well. So that's what I'm talking about when I say strategy. But what do we actually mean by digital as well? Because I think the digital part of digital strategy means many different things to different people. We actually take a very holistic view of this here at Charity Digital. So first of all, digital technology, so it means electronic tools, systems, devices, and resources that generate, store, or process data. Again, a Wikipedia definition. If you go to the Co-op, who did some good pioneering work on digital, they define digital as applying the culture, practices, processes, and technologies of the internet era to respond to people's raised expectations. So you see from that definition, it's gone suddenly way beyond specific technologies and tools, talking about culture, processes. So very, very different. And when we look at it from Charity Digital, we include all of those in how we look at digital strategy. In terms of the actual technologies as well, we think about infrastructure, we think about office productivity tools, be it Office or Google Suite, data storage, security, customer relationship management, fundraising, digital service delivery, and this massive range. But we believe a good digital strategy actually needs to consider all of these, because at different points for your organization, these areas can all become critical, and therefore if they've been ignored and forgotten about, that critical issue can then become a major constraint and actually stop you achieving what you want to do. Let's talk a little bit about why I think many organizations find producing a digital strategy hard. I've certainly seen some research which says that a number of charities don't actually have an organization strategy. So if you haven't got an organization strategy, it's going to be kind of difficult to produce a good digital strategy. So that's always got to be the start point. I'm going to assume today that everybody on this call does have an organization strategy. The second challenge is lack of knowledge of digital and technology. And again, this is a big challenge because digital and technology is such a big, big space. So it's actually super hard to get your head around all of it. And actually, I would say don't try and do that generally. Try and actually use assembled knowledge of different people to get there. But I think, if somebody's approaching this from this perspective of, oh, I need to know all about digital in great detail in order to do the strategy, they're going to find it hard. Then we've got the management of stakeholders. So even in a small charity, where maybe it's a really tight executive team and not that many employees, so you can actually get everybody within the charity very quickly bought into a strategy. There's still then the trustees, and maybe you're not seeing your trustees that often, but they need to be bought in. You can't just give them a strategy at the end of the day that they've never even seen before and expect them to sign that off without any time to buy into it, to understand it, and agree with it. Then we've got fear of change. Digital, both in terms of introduction of tools, but also in terms of changes to people's jobs, processes, that drives fear. I think we see that in many areas, and digital certainly brings that to the fore. Then we have culture. Cultures that are maybe both resistant to change and maybe just not not correctly oriented in order to be able to make the most of digital technology. And I'll be touching on this again in more detail later. And I think one of the challenges for those organizations that maybe have become more digital in their culture, so they're kind of thinking more about iterating quickly, learning environments, all words we talk about in digital, sometimes they can lose track of the long term. So busy iterating that you forget that you need to hook into a long-term framework of strategic objectives as well. So we need to kind of constantly balance this short-term iteration and learning with this hooking into, well, what are the strategic goals of this organization? So those are all the things I think make digital strategy hard. They're also what make it super interesting, because it means there's so many different aspects to delve into. Now we've got this framework. It's one we developed ourselves, but kind of calling on quite a number of other different sources. I'm not saying this is the only way to do things. I'm not even saying it's the best way to do things. This is just a model that you might find useful to help produce a digital strategy. It appears as a linear model, you know, the arrows point from left to right. And in one sense, you know, you do need to be starting with organization, vision, and strategy to drive your digital strategy. And at the end, you need to produce some kind of plan and output. And therefore, that needs to be produced through some kind of project planning, budgeting, phasing process. So yes, the ends do kind of both need to happen. But you can kind of jump into a model like this at different points. You can certainly loop around between different stages as well. So you might start with a bit of work on the organization side, jump into this stage of called planning activities, loop back into the organization vision and update it with what you've learned from that activity. So very much it's not prescriptive. If you're starting from a relatively an advanced position, I wouldn't say you need to do all of these in detail. In actual fact, I'd say don't do them all in detail because it'll take too long. You know, a good strategic planning exercise isn't going to take you 6 months or a year, because the problem if it takes so long is you're not getting to actually doing anything. So actually producing a plan relatively quickly around maybe the areas you do understand well, and then putting in that plan, let's build out the detail in other areas later, is a good way to approach it. So that's the framework I'm going to be talking to today. We're going to dip into each of these in a bit more detail, and we'll have some time at the end to answer some questions. And do by means actually submit your questions at any point through this process, through the chat function. Michelle will be storing them up and firing them at me at the end. So let's start off by talking about this first stage of actually engaging with the strategy and the vision. I've got a couple of examples here, which are kind of evolutions of other organizations. I don't really want to identify the organization specifically, but you'll probably recognize the types of things we're talking about here. So the first one, we've got an organization that has a vision to eliminate poverty internationally. And the key actions there are acquire new and retain current supporters and facilitate long-term engagement in order to help us raise funds and influence governments and institutions that keep people in poverty. So this really calls out from a digital perspective. This is already calling out, you know, how can digital actually help fundraise more? How can digital help with the communications process in particular? And then the second line here is all around efficiencies in the head office, in order that we're maximizing the use of the resources we've got. So this is starting to call out what type of technologies might enable the head office to operate more efficiently, and how might it connect more efficiently with the overseas branches. So a mixture, maybe there are some back office processes and some communication technologies. The other example, find a cure and improve life for everyone suffering from disease X. So here the objective is to increase the reach that the charity has overall and the speed at which it's delivering its services, with the aim of reducing the number of people living with the condition and improving the lives of those people living with the condition. And then secondly, again, another efficiency objective there, as well. So the first of the objectives kind of calls out more in the area of whole digital service delivery, maybe information provision, guidance and support, and the role that digital can provide there. So I think the real key thing here is spending the time to dig into the strategy and start to tease out the links to digital. They might not always be obvious. If they're not, it's not a problem, because the other stages in the process will focus us in on other areas of what the charity does in order to then identify the digital opportunities. But some of them might stand out early on. So if they do stand out early on, call them out and recognise them. The next stage I want to talk about is establishing digital baseline. And I've got 4 areas I'm going to touch on here. I'm going to touch on business processes. I'm going to talk about applications, as in software applications. I'm going to talk about infrastructure and digital maturity assessment. So this is a model of business processes. We've got 3 kind of key types of business processes here. So at the top of the chart, we've got the processes around the management and governance of the charity. And at the bottom, we've got what I'll call the supporting processes, so things that run finance, HR, those types of things. And then in the middle, we have the operational processes. And the operational processes really break down into 2 key categories. There is the service delivery, so the processes that are actually supporting the beneficiaries. And there are those processes which are focused more on the commercials, so things like how we're actually raising funds, how we're communicating to both our beneficiaries and to our supporters in the marketplace. If we're campaigning to change policy as well, how are we actually doing that? So the reason we put this chart in, this step of actually considering the business processes, is that, and again, your main strategic planning process might already have done this, they often do, is an opportunity to start to think about how the digital is linking to those business processes and what the opportunities for improvement might be. The next slide looks at business applications. It's a busy slide, there's a lot on it. As I say, we are circulating these slides afterwards, so you'll get plenty of time to look at it. The idea actually is, if you've done that whole business process mapping step, then you can actually start to think about, well, what are the applications that are then actually supporting each of those business processes? And you can start to ask questions about each of those applications. So you can look at its age. So is this an aging application that it's going to need replacing, really, because it's not really fit for purpose anymore? You can look at what's the forward route map for this application. Is it meeting the needs? If it's not meeting the needs, are there new things coming out that are going to meet the needs? How well supported is it as well? Is it internally supported? Is it supported by a third-party vendor? And coming out of this process of considering applications, we'd be looking to identify recommendations. So recommendations for where there are gaps, where there are things that should be retired, where there are things that should be replaced, where there are new things that should be introduced. Following on from the applications, we then look at infrastructure more. So I think the key point about infrastructure, when it works well, we just don't think about it. It's just there in the background doing its job. Infrastructure, when it works badly, is a real pain. We end up wasting lots of time. So purpose here again is to consider what is the infrastructure of the charity. Some of this will be the infrastructure which is actually supporting applications on the previous slide. It also looks at other areas like data storage. What are the people actually using as devices as well? All of that comes into here. And again, we're trying to look at the age, so the things that should be retired, the support, what the future life of those applications, that infrastructure is. So there's a nice logical flow, therefore, through kind of process applications and infrastructure. When we're looking at baselining, we then want to complement this with a view of digital maturity. I think some of you might be familiar with this model. This one actually came from the NCVO Digital Maturity Matrix. There are quite a number of different digital maturity tools, but this is one of the ones I really like. It complements quite nicely what I've been talking about with the processes, applications, and infrastructure, because it starts, though there's a bit of overlap, it starts to bring in other areas as well. So it starts to consider the approach to communications, the approach to leadership, content as well. And if you're not familiar with this model, this tool, you'll know that, you won't know, but I'll now explain that it enables you both to map out where you would like your organization to be. So you answer a series of questions online, and from that it gives you a radar chart of where you'd like to be, which is the orange dotted line, and to map against that where you currently are as an organization, which is the solid bit in the middle. And from that, you have an opportunity to identify, well, what are the actual actions we might want to take to increase our maturity on any one of these 8 different dimensions. So really, by considering these tools, you have an opportunity to really start to identify quite a number of areas where you might make changes from a digital perspective in your organization. Our next stage we want to spend some time actually thinking about trends and opportunities. So these are so what I've been talking to up to now has predominantly been internal. The trends and opportunities is actually looking outside the organization. And there's 2 predominant aspects. One is what's actually happening in technology, obviously relevant, and the other is demographic. So technology is obviously changing all the time, and that provides opportunities to actually change services, change fundraising approaches. So one of the big things was published in a report I looked at recently was the emergence of gaming, and gaming not just for gaming's sake, but gaming actually effectively as a form of social media where people are actually, communicating and working with their friends in a gaming environment, but then doing a lot more than just playing the game. And that seems to be a major emergence, which could be, I'm not saying it is, could be relevant to your charity. So here are some examples of other technology trends you might want to consider. And the aim is to say, what does this mean for us? Do we change our services? Are there new opportunities to communicate and fundraise as a result of these technologies? Can we introduce more efficiencies? When we look at the demographic side of things, we can look at, well, are the sizes of different subgroups changing dramatically? Obviously, we've got an aging population, so we know the number of people over the age of 65 is increasing dramatically. So what does that mean? We also know that the preference of groups changes. So young people today vastly prefer interacting through text to actually voice-based calls. So I know, for example, my kids hate picking up a telephone and talking to people, but they'll happily message. Now that's a demographic change that has really only come out over the last 10 years. So we need to be considering what are the implications of these changes for our services. That kind of takes me through, I guess, one set of planning and stimulus materials. If you remember back to the chart, I had 3 blocks. One looked at this thing called planning activities, one was looking at people and change, and one was looking at infrastructure, data and risk more. Talk about each of those in a bit more detail now. So planning activities, it's a bit of a placeholder to capture a number of different areas which I think should be considered, which don't naturally fit elsewhere in the framework. There isn't time to talk about all of these in great detail, so I'll quickly go through. The guide has a lot more detail. So starting with reporting, I think the importance here is first of all focusing in what are the key strategic metrics that you want to be reporting on. So understanding what those are. And understanding how you're going to get to those metrics and how often you're going to report on those. This is a subject that we're really into at Charity Digital. So our whole strategic framework then boils down into annual objectives, and then boil down into quarterly objectives across a whole range of different areas, which all of our employees are responsible for updating on a weekly basis. So we have distributed updating of all of those metrics, and we look at those as an organisation every week. Moving on to innovation, there's some useful, well, hopefully useful models of innovation that we've got in the guide. So we look at kind of disruptive innovation, which uses maybe new business models. We look at radical innovation, which is using new competencies. And we look at innovation, which is basically more as-is innovation. So we're not introducing new competencies or new business models, but we're still innovating within our current context as well. So there's some stimulus material you can look at which talks about that. Project and product management, we're thinking about, particularly if you're a larger organisation, what are your standard approaches to delivering projects? And from a product management perspective, if you're delivering services digitally, it's sometimes useful to look at those as a product. So how do we actually evolve that product for the consumers of it? So what new features should we be introducing for them and when? That kind of overlaps with the subject of service delivery. And the real key here on service delivery is to make sure we're obviously putting the user at the center of those services. So we're being user-led in terms of those services we're providing. Moving on to the communications planning. So the key things in communications planning are considering really both our different audiences in sufficient detail, considering if we've got different teams in the organisation who are communicating at different times, but maybe overlapping on subject area, how we actually plan those communications so that they reinforce each other, rather than kind of seem to hit the audiences with lots of different content at different times, which maybe don't reinforce each other. And I certainly know of one organisation when they were running their kind of year-end campaign going into December, that they were actually able to double the revenue that they got from that fundraising campaign as a result of much better communications planning across the organisation. Audience insight, which should be key to driving the communications planning. So how are we getting those insights? Are we getting those through Google Analytics? How are we using, if we've got a CRM system, how are we using that? Are we looking at the fundraising data that we're getting in? Are we doing any surveys? So there's a whole range of different ways in which we might actually consider how we build those audience insights. And then finally, actually planning the content that we're putting in front of those audiences in order to achieve the type of outcome that we might want. So just quickly moving on, this is the model that we've actually got in the guide as a content planning. Obviously, content planning in itself could, we've actually done a webinar on this that took a whole session, but this just follows a cycle of looking at, what is the organisation trying to achieve? So if it's trying to eliminate a certain condition or alleviate the suffering of people with the condition, identifying that, evidencing that condition to supporters so that they're more eager to contribute and support that cause. So bringing things like case studies there. What's the solution we're providing? The case study can be expanded. And actually, what do we want people to do at the end of the day? So very, very quick touch on that from a content planning perspective. I'll spend a bit more time on people and change. I think, so one of the challenges some organisations have had in the past when maybe they've viewed digital strategy planning as a more technical activity is that this aspect can get really overlooked, and if this aspect gets overlooked, you're not going to achieve what you want overall at the end of the day. It's certainly going to hold you back. So the types of areas that we'd be looking to consider in the people and change section. Certainly, what is the current staff experience of the digital tools and technologies that are being used within the organisation? Let's make sure that we're actually taking their input and we're understanding their thoughts, feelings and opinions as we shape that digital strategy. Digital leadership is incredibly important to me. And one of the subjects I like to talk about is the difference between what I will call expert digital leadership and empowering and coaching digital leadership. So the former relies on someone or people who know digital in great detail and great depth, and they lead through that expert knowledge. The latter, which is focused more on empowering and enabling, really says that the leader doesn't need to be any kind of expert in the digital technologies here. What they will do is they will work with the people who are the experts to bring that knowledge to the fore, and they will ensure that other people in the organization get involved, that they understand what they need to know. They will remove roadblocks that might exist. They will take the difficult decisions as well. So one of the difficult decisions an organization might hit, if it doesn't have the right skills, it might actually need to reshape its workforce, which could mean letting some people go and employing some new people. And that tends to be fairly unusual. Most of the time you can actually evolve your workforce okay, but sometimes difficult decisions do need to be made. And part of leadership is making those difficult decisions and seeing that they're implemented. So that digital leadership is really, really important. Quite a number of different areas within culture to consider. So first of all, we've got creating the right motivation. So creating an environment within the organization in which people want to embrace digital rather than resist it. Moving on from there, we've got the whole how are we actually empowering people so that they can then actually take on the tasks and activities they need to do. How are we getting them to collaborate with each other? Because a lot of digital initiatives actually require people in different teams to collaborate. So actually creating a culture in which people will collaborate. I touched on this theme of learning and iteration. So one of the great things with where technology is now is a lot of changes can be actually technically implemented quite quickly, which provides a great opportunity to try things out, maybe on a small scale to start with, see what works, learn from that and build on it. But obviously kind of creating that environment where it's all right to try, experiment, fail sometimes and learn from that. That's a big culture change for a lot of organizations. So that needs to be led. There's obviously a join up here to the whole digital leadership theme again. Digital capacity. So what capabilities do we have within the organization to support digital, and how many people have those capabilities is obviously critical, because if we don't have the capacity, we're not going to be able to introduce any type of change. So we need to both understand that capacity, understand what capacity we might need, and work out how we're going to get it. Now, part of getting it might be we can work with third parties and we might contract them to do some things, particularly early on, and then we might transition some of those skills into the organisation over time. It's also worth considering here, are we looking at a centralised approach where all the digital skills sit in the one team in the middle? Are we looking at what they call a hub and spokes model, where we've got a smallish team in the middle, but then capabilities distributed out to teams across the organisation, or a fully decentralised model where there's no capability in the middle and all the capability sits in teams distributed across the organisation? I'm not saying any one of those models is right or wrong. Different models are actually tend to be right at different points in time. So it's a matter of working out which of those is going to work for you. Learning and development then is obviously one key way of addressing gaps that there are within the capacity overall. So where you have existing skills mismatches, how can you actually set about developing and evolving the skills of the current workforce in order to fill those gaps? And sometimes that's going to need recruitment as well, to bring in skills that can't easily or can't be quickly enough developed in-house. And I think one of the key things here then is to be realistic in terms of budgeting for those resources. They might cost more than existing resources, and if you don't budget for it accordingly, you won't be able to get those resources. And if the strategy says you need those resources, you need them. So a whole bundle of things there under people and change. It's a really, really deep topic. I've done a whistle-stop tour here, but the aim is, to present a framework which lets you consider all of these different aspects and balance them out. So the last of those three key detailed planning blocks is technology, risk and data. I've touched on infrastructure already. So the importance here is really making sure that, first of all, people in the organization have the right, people have the right devices to be able to do their jobs. Bandwidth can be critically important as well. So if we become more digital within our organization, we might need a lot more internet bandwidth. If we haven't planned for that, then that becomes a constraint, particularly if we're maybe looking at people who are mobile out in the field, becoming more enabled. They need both the devices and the communications to be able to work with the systems. Data. This tends to become more of an issue as people move along the maturity curve. So people start off from, relatively few systems. They'll then maybe use a number of discrete applications to fulfill key activities. But those systems then quickly become islands of data that don't easily share information between themselves, which makes it really hard to kind of understand if you're looking, trying to form a consolidated view of a supporter or a beneficiary. It's really hard to form that view, and people end up doing things like manually moving data around, and it just becomes really, really time consuming. So it's actually at certain points in the digital strategic planning process, it's really important just to stand back and say, how are we actually managing data as a whole? And actually, do we need to actually spend some money on pulling this data together? It's something we've recently done in Charity Digital. We introduced a new digital platform in February, and one of the big objectives there was to enable us to have a lot more integrated data, because we were spending a lot of time manually cranking processes. Security, incredibly important, and again, subject that we've done many webinars on, both considering the security, our applications up to date. We obviously had Windows 7 went out of date earlier this year. That meant it became unsupported. Organizations that are still running on Windows 7 therefore have critical security risks within them. What software are you putting on the endpoint, on the desktop, then to protect that? Are you using any technologies to monitor for breaches, to monitor for other risks as well? So we've recently been doing some work with a company called Scurio, who monitored data on the dark web to try and anticipate some potential risks. And then ethics. I think two aspects of ethics really coming to the fore. Artificial intelligence and algorithms, certainly. Algorithms are a real dirty word at the moment as a result of the government GCSEs and A-levels, where there was a fairly crass algorithm applied to achieve a top level kind of comparability of results to previous years. Obviously, the impact of that was totally ignored the capability of individuals, and ignored cohort performances, all types of considerations that were just ignored, and that I would say was actually deeply unethical at the end of the day. So I think kind of making sure when you're introducing technologies, particularly if you're introducing any algorithms within those technologies, that they're ethical is really, really important. Also, if we're becoming more digital, we need to think about the people who can't use those services, maybe because they're not online, and make sure we're not locking those people out. So that's another really important aspect of ethics. Right, we're nearly at the end now, then we'll open up for questions. If you followed these previous stages, what you will have done is you will have generated a large amount of potential actions, a large amount of potential projects. So the challenge now becomes, well, what's the priority? Which should we progress first, and in what order? And I'd recommend a framework that looks something like this. So on one axis, I consider impact. So impact can be both impact on beneficiaries and impact on funding and sustainability as well, because all of those things join together. So impact on one axis and cost and resource on the other. with the aim that, we want to prioritize those things which are high impact and low cost. Some of the higher impact things, though, do often tend to cost a bit more, so they will become strategic investments. Things that are low impact and high cost, we should absolutely just ignore those. And then there'll be areas which can be tactically deployed because they're medium impact but low cost. And often those areas can be quite good to do in the short term, particularly if you're trying to get some momentum into a digital program, because you can deploy them quickly, you can show some positive results, and that kind of can build more buy-in and commitment. So the whole aim here is to test each of the areas, the potential projects we've developed against the matrix such as this, and to prioritize as a result of that, and then start to phase. And the next slide, I've got an example of how we might turn all of these areas I've been talking about into a digital strategic plan. It follows those 3 key blocks I talked about, so planning activities, people and change, technology, data and risk, and it follows them out over 3 years, which kind of gives a nice flow. One of the temptations is always to try and cram everything into year 1, and you end up with nothing in year 2 and year 3. So it's important to push some of those areas back in time, and it's okay to have less in the later years, because as you move through, you'll obviously identify new things you want to do as a result of the learning that you get. And the final slide, before I open up for questions, just want to consider a few other key subjects. So stakeholder management, I touched on it at the outset. It's obviously incredibly important. So the key thing, first of all, is to try and involve your stakeholders through the process. A framework such as I've described would actually be really hard for one person to do on their own anyway. So maybe, there's some people, and change could be devolved to somebody with more of an HR orientation to look at that. The planning activities, the marketing and fundraising people are going to have a big role to play in that one as well. And then the infrastructure, the more technical people can pull that up. So both working to bring people into the planning process all the way along is really important. You can use the maturity matrix approach to actually get different people involved in the assessment as well, and you could get the board to do that. So the key is involve people through the process, including the board, so that they're not signing something off at the end that is totally a surprise to them. The strategy should be constantly refreshed in the light of experience. So the days of the strategy that is written and sits on the shelf, kind of ignored and is then looked at once a year to update it, those are gone. We should be learning from our experiences and actually not being afraid to change and tune certain areas. If we've done the exercise well, the broad strategic direction will probably be correct and not change dramatically, but some of the details of the actions and the priorities can change from that learning. Big point is not to boil the ocean at the start. I have shared with you a framework that is pretty demanding, pretty challenging to complete all of that. If you're starting at an earlier stage, don't try and do all of that in one go. Pick off the areas that are easier to do, form a plan around those, and then just put on the plan that you're going to do some of the other areas over the coming year and fill those out, so that the next iteration you'll have a fuller plan. And again, linked to that, don't seek perfection. There is no perfection in this. We're always dealing with unknowns and uncertainties. So good enough will do. Let's get a plan that is good enough to move forward on, because we're going to change it. We're going to iterate it anyway. And the big thing to bear in mind is, the action should always link back to the strategic priorities. If we're linking to the strategic priorities, then even though some of the details will turn out wrong, we'll learn they're wrong, but as long as we're broadly focusing on the strategic priorities, we will move in the right direction, and we will have a digital strategy that better supports our organisation and increases our impact and sustainability, which is what I think we're all about at the end of the day. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour there. I'll very quickly go to questions now. I've overrun a little bit in my presentation, for which I apologise, but let's open up now. Michelle, would you like to lead us through this?